Okay, thank you all. If I can get everybody's attention, we're going to get started on our next panel. So we talked a little bit about, everyone, we'll get our next panel up here. So we talked a little bit about the role of regulation in the future of blockchain. So we are going to welcome back Dominic, and he'll be joined by Ed Knight, who's the Executive Vice President and Global Chief Legal and Policy Officer of Nasdaq. We're also very honored to be joined by Kathryn Haun, who's just announced the newest general partner at A16Z Crypto, which is a $300 million venture fund. Ed, Dom, Kathryn, coming up.
Where do you want me?
You always need one lawyer, don't you?
We always need one lawyer there.
Who's playing the lawyer here?
Ed's our chief regulator. He's going to play. But you are a prosecutor, right?
I was a prosecutor. Not anymore, though.
You've been reinvented. That's great. So, Kathryn, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what you're doing now with A16 Crypto?
So my background is, as you just alluded to, I was a federal prosecutor for 12 years, and I had been a lawyer in a prior life before that, too, in private practice. I used to do murders, organized crime, gangs, cybercrime, and then somehow in 2012 got introduced into, I see your puzzled look, into cryptocurrency. I was asked for the government to shut down Bitcoin in 2012 and help prosecute Bitcoin in 2012, which I had never heard of Bitcoin back then. And I went home, and my husband quickly educated me on how that would not be possible and taught me all about it. And that set me off on a path of really discovery and getting really excited about the technology. And actually, there were a lot of people in the government, even back then, very excited as they learned about some of these technologies, very early days. So that was my background. I prosecuted some of the biggest criminal use cases involving cryptocurrency. No different than had I been prosecuting wire fraud with wires or cash with, with crimes with traditional fiat. So anyway, that was my background, and I left the Justice Department about a year ago. I joined the board of Coinbase and a white hat hacking company called HackerOne, and just was announced Monday with Andreessen Horowitz.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's great. So we do a lot with Andreessen, so it's great to see you over there. That's great. Ed, why don't you give a quick background for the audience?
Well, I've been at NASDAQ since 1999 and took the company public with you and a lot of other people. And as we split off from the National Association of Securities Dealers, and before that I was the general counsel of the U.S. Treasury Department and did that for a number of years in the Clinton administration.
Yeah, I mean, people don't realize that Nasdaq itself was a nonprofit regulatory agency for many years and went public in 2003. So we are a far public exchange now. So let's get into the topics that we touched on earlier. And maybe Dom, I get to start off. We talked about ISOs, and they've been a popular topic of the media and across the global recently. So let's start by making sure everybody understands exactly what an ICO is. I call ICO, but that's ICOs. I know.
An ICO is an automated sale of tokens designed to raise money to fund the development of some kind of tokenized system. So, for example, the first big ICO raised $18 million for a system called Ethereum, which is a smart contract platform that today I forget what it's worth, but it's valued in the tens of billions. And back then, we were able to buy Ether tokens for 29 cents each, if I recall correctly. And recently they peaked at $1,400 each. So they made a tremendous return for investors. And it also introduced a new business model because there's no company behind Ethereum. So the natural question is to ask, why isn't there a company backing this wonderful new service? And the answer is that the Ethereum network is valuable precisely because there isn't a company behind it. There are well-known individuals like Vitalik Buterin that, work on designing developments to the network and so on. But you could take these individuals away, you could take the Ethereum Foundation away, and the Ethereum network will continue to run. And that's what makes it exciting. So the business model had to change, and Ethereum set up a not-for-profit foundation in Switzerland. And when they promised to create this system that would have these initial tokens at Genesis, which is when the network first starts running, they sold those promises, if you like, for funds that they used to fund R&D. And eventually, once R&D was far enough along, they said they sort of pushed it out into the world and said, right, let's launch the Ethereum network using the Ethereum protocol. And so investors were able to realize a return through the appreciation in tokens that are created by a network that has no central party running it. It's a bit like the internet. It's a tokenized network, a token-operated network. Right. And so this is a completely new way of making a profit for investors and creating a service, right? And the reason it's done this way is, imagine if the internet depended on a company, right? It wouldn't be nearly so interesting. The internet is interesting because it's an internetwork, and it doesn't depend on any individual company or organization.
Well, I think a lot of the topics around regulation in the space is, what is a security? And so maybe Kathryn, I'd like you, the two former lawyer and the current lawyer, to talk about what is a security and what's not a security, because I think that's where people get kind of caught up in this conversation.
Well, I mean, everyone here probably has heard of, and I feel like I've heard the name, the Howey test, way too many times in the last year. But we all know it's a Supreme Court case from 1946 that gives basically 3 prongs that securities regulators, at least in the U.S., and let's be clear, different jurisdictions treat what is a security different ways. So right now we're just talking about the U.S., but it's basically an investment of money in a common enterprise, right, where there's an expectation of profits, and those profits come from the efforts of others. That's basically what this Supreme Court case from 1946 says. Actually, I don't know how many of you know that that case law was reaffirmed by a federal court late last night in Florida. A magistrate court, and it didn't make a ton of news. I saw there was a CoinDesk article about it. It didn't make a ton of news, I think, because it didn't contain a lot of analysis. It just merely applied the Howey test to the Carta ICO, which was this Floyd, is it Mayweather?
Oh.
Yeah. So it wasn't that groundbreaking, but it was interesting that a federal court, here we are seeing this application of law still. So that's what a security is. I mean, an ICO, I think we have to be careful because I think ICO connotates a public offering, and definitely not all ICOs are public offerings. Plenty of ICOs that have been done, number one, and plenty of ICOs that are yet to launch are actually conducted pursuant to exemptions. We talk about the Reg D exemption, which is for accredited investors. There's also an exemption that's really interesting that was passed by the Jobs Act. It's called a Reg A Plus offering. So it's kind of like a mini IPO. And so those are this is some general definitions we can talk about.
No, that's great. And Ed, maybe your perspective on
Well,
what is
I
security.
think it's important to take a step back for this audience in particular. So we're in the epicenter of the research and development center, arguably, of the world. And you and what a lot of people do here in this region innovates and creates economic growth around the world. And it's very important and it's very unique. Why does it happen here? There are 3 elements that economists focus on driving this sort of innovation. One is great research universities, like Stanford University, like Berkeley. 2 is entrepreneurship, which is a product of our culture and very unique, and we don't find it all over the world. We find it in certain places in the Nordics. We find it in Israel, where the entrepreneurial risk-taking culture takes hold. But the 3rd is well-functioning capital markets. That's what Nasdaq is, and we're very proud of what we've built. But what is a well-functioning capital market? It's a lot of things, but at its core is the rule of law. And in this country, the rule of law means many things. But in the capital markets, it means that when you have an investment contract, when you sell a security, you have expected to receive certain protections under federal law. And that includes registration of those securities, and that you tell the truth about those securities. And if you don't, you're subject to civil and criminal penalties. And that foundation means that investors can have confidence. And if you work outside that foundation, you're going to get in trouble. That creates the liquidity and the confidence we need to raise capital, to fund these great ideas that comes from this collaboration between entrepreneurs and research universities that makes this country very unique. But we can't get away from this, and we have to abide by these securities laws. The principles were laid down in a lot of different cases and statutes, but they've held up quite well. And we find when we get away from them, what happens? There are bad people everywhere. It doesn't mean that the products that you're creating are bad or that you're bad, but there are bad people. And they will take advantage of markets that are not regulated. And we see it time and time and again. So let me give you one example in Europe, a market that Nasdaq was very involved in, that was doing good, carbon credit market. It was established by the European governments to create a better environment in Europe. And we participated in that market and traded those credits and created a market for it. But the law hadn't caught up to it. They didn't have laws requiring the registration of the exchanges that were trading it. They didn't have laws regulating where those carbon credits were deposited. And even though the law was very well intentioned and those carbon credits were doing good, what happened? Bad people came in, the market was manipulated, the depositories were broken into, and that's what happens when the law has not evolved to catch up with the innovation. And I think this is a situation where we're facing with many of these new products we're talking about here. The law hasn't caught up to them. We do not have a Reg D. We don't have a Reg Crypto. And the SEC is struggling with that. And our regulators are smart, and the Justice Department is smart, but frankly, they are not great technology people. And they don't understand technology very well. And it takes them a while. But I don't think we can just say, well, the law hasn't caught up, let's leave the law behind. We don't need it. I think you need it. It is one of the core elements of what creates this place, is the rule of law.
Kathryn, can I get your perspective on that? I mean, what is the difference between traditional business and ICO?
Well, I just want to, let's get to that, but I do want to just say, I think one of the difficulties here, and the government knows this, I think, too, is that a lot of projects and entrepreneurs are struggling with, well, what is the law? They absolutely want to follow the law. And it's not even just the laws, it's the regulations. They want to follow the regulations, but they're not really quite sure how those apply. We definitely saw this SEC guidance last summer come out and say, well, these ICOs look like securities to us. But, really, what does that mean? What about, if we have this new asset class, and are there utility projects? Part of the issue, I think, is that we need to bring forward to government bodies, and by the way, it's not just the SEC. I don't want to be doom and gloom here. That's the one everyone focuses on because that's the one who's put out guidance. More agencies are getting active in this space, federally and at a state level, and I think you're going to expect to see a lot more of them coming out. I don't think that's a doom and gloom, though. I think there can be a lot to be done by working with some of these regulators. They want to have the good projects out there who are trying to be thoughtful about regulations and law come and work with them and help inform what makes sense in this new world. And I think one of the things I founded for the Justice Department, the first crypto task force in the federal government in 2015. And one of the reasons for that, one of our objectives was to bring together, and this was early days, this was before anyone had heard of ICOs, bring entrepreneurs in to talk to us and, frankly, help educate us. And, by the way, in the process, help educate them as well as to the kind of different background for a regulatory backdrop and what agencies were interested in what things. And I think there's a fear among certain projects and entrepreneurs, and if I understand the fear because if you've never been in the government and you've only watched about it on TV or you have your lawyers telling you one thing, I understand the fear, but the fact of the matter is a lot of these agencies really are looking to do a lot of outreach and have people come in and work with them collaboratively. There's a fear that they're going to say, aha, gotcha, I'm not going in to talk to them because then they're going to focus on me. I think that's not at all the case. I think they have so many ICOs where there was fraud committed and people behind those projects are not wanting to follow the law, are not wanting to be thoughtful, that really they don't have the resources to focus on every single potential violation. And it's really much more in their interest to work with some of these projects. So that's one perspective I think I have. I think you asked how it's different than
Yeah, how is
traditional capital.
I think those raise a lot of the concerns, but how do you feel it's different than?
Well, I mean, for one thing, it's global, right? It's very democratizing, kind of. At some level, anyone can participate. I think the fact of the matter is that capital is becoming more abundant, not just for investor capital, but capital is becoming more abundant. I think so. There's no question that it is changing the landscape a bit for traditional venture capital and just institutional investors. I think there's definitely still room for those investors to play, but I think it's really going to be how do those investors distinguish themselves? What value do they add to projects? What value are they adding to the entrepreneurs who are creating these new technologies? So I think that's how I think about the differences.
So Ed, why aren't we at NASDAQ listing a lot of ICOs?
Well, I think it goes back to the law hasn't caught up to the innovation. So first you'd have to, before you list on NASDAQ, take your S-1 to the draft to the SEC, Division of Corporation Finance, and they would put you through a series of questions and tests. They're all designed to test a traditional security. And so they would have a million questions for you, and it would take a very long time. But just to give you one example, the rules that the SEC has and that we have require that security be clearable at DTCC, the Central Clearinghouse Utility in the United States.
Right.
These coins, they will not accept for clearing at DTCC.
Right.
So just to start off, it wouldn't qualify, and you have to build an infrastructure somewhere to allow that clearing. So the law is not advanced enough to accept such a security and for us to list it at this point.
So it sounds like one of the reasons that you're saying is because DTCC, a legacy institution, that's the second reason, not just the law. It sounds like you're saying
the rules require that clearing. Our listing rules require that they be accepted by DTCC. The clearing, of course, means that you have some confidence that you're going to, when you sell the instrument, get your money, or when you give your money, that you're going to get the instrument. And that there is a depository. Part of DTCC is security around actually receiving the instrument. So where are these coins deposited? And is it a secure place? When we met with the chairman of the SEC, one of the issues in talking about this whole area and concerns he has is the security of the repository of Bitcoin or the coins generally. Are they in a secure place so that the investing public, I think it's important to understand the type of investor we're talking about. When it comes to the NASDAQ market, the traditional NASDAQ cash equities market, or an instrument that has been approved by the SEC, what do you think of when you think of those two? You think about something a man on the street or a woman on the street could invest in that's safe for them. And that is a big concern. It's one thing an accredited investor or a sophisticated investor or a large institution. It's another thing people taking their savings that they have for their children's education and investing it in something. And that's what we're talking about here. And that's why the SEC is so concerned, because their agency is concerned about investments for the average American citizen. And if they can't protect that, they get into a lot of trouble. And as an agency, and the public gets very mad.
And they're trying to do this too. I mean, the announcement of Val Stepanek as the crypto czar 2 weeks ago for the SEC, she was already doing this work since 2013 for the SEC. This was just formalization of her role. Many people don't also realize she's a government lawyer. She also has an engineering and computer science background and degree. So she actually is very familiar with this technology. And there are people in the SEC. I know the problem you just raised, Ed, with custody is a major concern of some of the government bodies, and frankly, a concern of many people in the space, not just the government regulators, is qualified custodian, and how do you secure these assets, both in hot wallets and in cold storage. Those are two very different things, right? You've got the hot wallets, you're talking about cybersecurity, but for cold storage, at some level, you're also talking about physical security.
Right. Right.
I don't want to be totally negative here, and it may sound negative. But let me give you an example of an innovation that occurred in the financial area. It took years, but exchange-traded funds, these hybrid securities, it took the SEC years to put the legal system in place where you could invest in an exchange-traded fund. Now they dominate the industry. That's where most of the trading occurs, is in that instrument. But the rules had to catch up, and it takes more time than we would like.
Can I chime in? So I think the challenge here is that technology develops at its own pace, and these decentralized technologies liberate enormous efficiencies, bring great benefits. They have provide huge potential, and they're being developed worldwide now. It's not just an industry in Silicon Valley, and it's not realistic to imagine that the decentralization industry will, stop developing these technologies and launching new networks and so on, while regulatory issues are cleared up. So, the SEC has a good reason to be concerned about consumer investors, and it's certainly true that these systems have made it much easier to raise money through things like ICOs, and all kinds of shady characters have stepped in to, separate uninformed investors from their money. That's a fact. But nonetheless, this technology is going to continue developing at pace, and it's going to continue developing independently of the speed with which regulation adapts. Now, the difficulty here is the following, okay? That, on the one hand, when the SEC exerts pressure on the industry, warning people that it considers maybe that all tokens are securities, although I'm very pleased, I think that recently it said that Ether isn't a security, right? So that's immense progress. But when it makes those kind of declarations, what it does is push kind of operations like DFINITY out of the ICO space. So we spent an awful lot of money on lawyers internationally trying to work out how we could do an ICO, because we wanted to give as many people as possible the chance to participate in the project in the same way that Ethereum was able to give a lot of people the chance to participate. In the end, we concluded it wasn't practical and that we couldn't risk our operations by doing something that might fall foul of regulators, and we did this airdrop where we distributed like $35 million worth of tokens.
Explain airdrop for a minute.
So we simply went through our various community channels and built up a recipient list, and just gave those people the chance to go through a KYC AML process and receive DFINITY tokens for free. And we just wanted our community members to have these tokens so they could be able to play with the internet computer. And interestingly, actually, we couldn't give anybody in the US these tokens, because it turns out that you could view a distribution of tokens, even for free, as an illegal securities distribution designed to stimulate demand, right? So, it really is a difficult area. And, we were fortunate in that we had hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on lawyers, right, to investigate all of this. Most startups aren't in that position, right? And in fact, they're looking at, an ever-shortening runway, and they certainly don't want to be spending even $100,000 on lawyers. And, the space is more complex than any of you may realize. It extends from the US regulatory environment to international regulatory environments. So for example, one of the things we looked at doing was using the services of CoinList, which is this kind of regulated ICO framework created by the guys from AngelList. Really good service. The reason we didn't use it actually was that FINMA, which is the Swiss financial regulator, introduced some new guidelines that appeared to indicate that any kind of automated sale of tokens whatsoever, like any automated sale of tokens, is classified as an ICO, even if you're only selling the tokens to accredited investors and doing all of the appropriate KYC and ML. So, even though CoinList would have satisfied US regulators because of the way it's set up, we would have needed to have delayed our fundraising by getting a special ruling from FINMA to proceed. So, we just ended up doing this private pre-sale, selling Genesis tokens to people that had come to us. And, that's fine for our purposes, but we would have liked to have made them more broadly available. So it is a complex environment. Now, the difficulty is that when, you hear things like all tokens are securities, and organizations like DFINITY sort of back away from the space, it leaves consumers with worse choices, right? So, DFINITY certainly does worry about regulations and is very mindful about its operations and not getting, doesn't want to be distracted by, unwanted dealings with regulators. But, somebody outside of the reach of the law, in Russia, say, right, just doesn't give a damn what American regulators think. And they will run all kinds of schemes to separate uninformed investors from their money, and it has been happening on an absolutely massive scale. Now, the way to address that is not by banging a drum and making all these noises about how anyone involved in crypto is going to go to jail and they're all in breach of regulations and so on. The way to address that problem is by, bringing in traditional financial organizations to provide some kind of quality control. So, on the one hand, we need traditional financial organizations to provide quality control, indices of quality, if you like. And on the other hand, of course, it is useful if regulators pursue, obvious frauds and egregious bad practices. But, just standing back and making scary noises about how everyone in the industry is doing bad things with tokens actually is very counterproductive for consumer investors. It just leaves them with no guidelines at all in an environment where some of the better operations are withdrawing, leaving them with worse choices.
And I think they've started to realize this, actually, which is one of the reasons they're starting to encourage projects to come in and meet with them. And also we're seeing some states doing this, including states that have been issuing cease and desist letters. I think they're realizing that, Dom, not just that those actors are in Russia, but like you're going to have bad actors, as Ed said. You're going to have them anyway. You still have them, right? There are still fraudulent actors out there. And I think your point is very well taken, that it's leaving those people. It's not chilling their conduct because they don't care. But it's chilling good projects. And I think regulators are starting to realize that, and at the same time starting to realize that this technology is moving forward, frankly, anyway.
Yeah.
And so that we might as well encourage and work with good projects. When I talk to government regulators, what they say is, well, where are the good projects? Why don't any come to see us? And it's very interesting because then when I talk in the space to the industry, they say, and I had someone in DC recently say, not at the SEC, it was a congressman said, well, but what about this Linden coin and Paris Hilton and Floyd Mayweather? That's what they're hearing about. I say, let's go show them some good projects, actually. Some projects where people are being thoughtful, are being mindful, making these kinds of arguments. I think that's really important because just like a lot of people in the industry, when they think of government, they wouldn't recognize that actually there are some thoughtful people in these regulatory bodies. So I really think that they've realized this and they're starting to encourage, at least at the SEC, that kind of communication. And each agency has very different objectives, obviously. When you're talking about DOJ and criminal, that's a whole other ball of wax. Right. So really we're talking about agencies like CFPB, Also, Ed, your old place, Treasury, OFAC, and FinCEN kind of getting into the game too. But each of these agencies has slightly different objectives and I do believe that they really don't want to just drive away all of the bad projects, either drive away the bad projects or drive them all out of the jurisdiction of the U.S.
And it's important to say as well, there are an awful lot of good projects in this industry. I would estimate that there's never been such an influx of amazing talent into any industry. And what you can't see behind the scenes, there are thousands of nascent projects being driven by very, very well-intentioned, brilliant people. It's incredible how many academics are coming into the fray. This really is the sort of next evolution of the internet. It's huge, and it's also happening worldwide, and it's unstoppable. And I would certainly say that it has democratized startups, and that's a fantastic thing. When I love Silicon Valley, and to some extent I escaped Europe. It's a much harder environment to create startups in. But now when I travel, and I was in Europe last week, I find all of these startups in places like Switzerland and Berlin and so on that have got funding because of the ICO mechanism. Right. And so I think we're going to see a sort of renaissance in the tech industry where instead of all of the startups being in Silicon Valley, they're going to be appearing worldwide. The big ones are going to be appearing worldwide. So it's very important that American regulators don't introduce heavy-handed tactics and regulation that disadvantage, the U.S. tech economy, because Silicon Valley is a very valuable thing, right? It generates an awful lot of tax revenue, and it, from the perspective of the U.S., it'd be a great shame if it was disadvantaged enormously by regulation. And I know of many operations that have moved out of Silicon Valley to Europe because they're worried about the U.S. regulatory environment. And an example would be Gnosis, right? Martin Koppelman was based in Palo Alto when I first knew him, and I think his wife was a physicist at Stanford. And now he's based in Berlin. Gnosis has got like a $2 billion cap or something. It's pretty valuable, right? So, imagine if the U.S. regulatory environment was more friendly. That might have resulted in, more mass for Silicon Valley and substantial tax revenues for the U.S. So I think that's a, really concrete example of the consequences of heavy-handed regulation and fear about regulatory uncertainty. It actually has, serious consequences for the development of the economy, right?
I think I want to echo what you just said about the great projects. I teach at Stanford Business School cryptocurrency, and the students there who come from a wide variety of different fields, and plenty of CS and Eng folks as well, they're super fired up to do these projects. They come to office hours. They want to know, is our tokens illegal, right? They very much top of mind, but the projects that you're hearing about are really exciting there. And actually at that class, I invited DOJ, the SEC, all of the current regulatory czars to come and guest lecture one, and they came, and the students were very excited to hear from them, because I think if you would have sat in that class, you would have heard kind of what I'm saying tonight is very true. And you ask them, why don't you come and meet like this with these companies? And they say, like, no one's inviting us, which, again, understandable. But I think there's a lot of exciting there are a lot of exciting projects going on in this space, and a lot of really cool technology. So echo that.
That's great. So we are getting close to the end of our time, but I want to give each one of you one chance to ask. So we've talked about the problems. We like solutions here at the Entrepreneurial Center. So what's one or two things that the U.S. has to do to kind of, get out of its way and make this regulation a reality? We'll start with you, Ed.
Well, I think the SEC is starting to do it. They're starting to put guidance out. The director of the Division of Corporation Finance, which regulates this area, as we discussed, has put out more detail. But I think what is really needed is a clear safe harbor for people to understand. if they use these coins, how can they do it safely under the securities law? So there was confusion at what time in our investment history around private placements, and Reg D was developed to allow that. We need a Reg Crypto where the rules are clear, where people understand where the safe harbor is. Everyone wants to do the right thing, I understand, in this area. It is confusing, but these are laws that are fundamental to our economy and are fundamental to Silicon Valley and help Silicon Valley in many ways. Allow Nasdaq, for instance, to trade this year $11 trillion in securities will pass through our market alone. And that's a very liquid market. It's a very valuable market. It's based upon these laws.
I think two things. I don't think we should have a crypto reg because I think if you do it, it's going to be outdated within a year because the technology keeps changing so quickly. I do think, though, your point about we need guidance, formal guidance that people can rely on, and I think that comes in two forms. One, it comes in the forms of no action letters, which is a remedy that the SEC can give. So you can do no action letters and make those public. So we can see, oh, that's clearly on this side of the line, they're not taking action. We also need to see, ironically, more enforcement actions with spelled out against who and why. If you look at a lot of the enforcement actions to date, they've had allegations of fraud in them. I think every one has had an allegation of fraud. So I think we need more enforcement. I'm not advocating for enforcement actions. I'm saying we need more to understand so people can understand, oh, this is that side of the line. Now the no action letters are this side of the line. I think that kind of formal guidance is what is going to give people comfort rather than, as I'm saying, just coming and meeting informally. You want something you can rely on, and I think that's what we need.
So, I'd like to see a mixture of light touch and heavy touch. So, echoing your sentiment, I think there are a lot of quite obviously shady projects out there, and, different agencies should go after them. Sometimes you don't even need securities law to go after them, right? I mean, there's things like the Trade Descriptions Act or its equivalent in the US. I think that's a bit of UK regulation. But, if people are lying about what they're doing and putting up pages with fake teams and all that kind of stuff.
We've been on some of those, haven't we?
Yeah. I mean, there are existing laws, right, which can be brought to bear to, help push these guys out of business. And so anything that can be done to dissuade people from doing shady, bad things, I think is enormously positive. So, on the one hand, hopefully regulators can take a really light touch and allow innovation to blossom, right? And make sure that exciting companies don't leave the US, because Silicon Valley is an amazing powerhouse of talent and creativity, and it's very important that that's not harmed. So that needs a light touch. On the other hand, while regulation's catching up to the technology, which will probably take several years, I certainly think regulators will find lots of things to occupy them, right? There's lots and lots of egregious and shady operations out there that probably do need to be curtailed. And so I would definitely encourage them to be bold and go after these people.
Well, thank you all. We are out of time, but it's been a very fascinating conversation. So I really appreciate Ed, Kathryn, Dominic, and Olaf for joining us tonight. Please stick around. We have refreshments after the talk, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thanks.